You find yourself in London in the middle of the 19th century. The year is 1847, and the winter has already set in with its full, grey authority. The Thames, sluggish and brown even in the best of months, moves like molasses under a skin of floating ice. The air smells of coal and cabbage. The faint light of the morning struggles through a thick yellow haze that never really lifts. It merely shifts dimly as the sun arcs low across the sky. You can hear the rhythmic clatter of iron, shod boots on wet cobblestones, the crunch of frost under a cartwheel, and the faint hum of human life fighting against the season. Winters in Victorian London were not just cold. They were brutal in ways that are difficult for the modern mind to comprehend. Not because of blizzards or freezing temperatures alone, but because of how every element of city life conspired to make the season an endurance test. The city was a living machine powered by coal, and coal was everywhere. Every home, from the narrowest East End tenement to the stately terraces of Kensington, burned it for warmth. The result was the famous London fog, though it was not fog at all. It was smog, a choking mixture of soot, sulfur dioxide, and damp air that could turn a white handkerchief black in minutes. On some mornings, visibility dropped to mere feet. Lamplighters had to light the gas lamps at noon. Policemen carried lanterns even in daylight. For the poor, coal was both salvation and slow poison. The cheapest kind, known as nutty slack, or dust coal, burned with a thick, acrid smoke. Families would crowd around a tiny grate, the fire barely large enough to warm their hands. The heat never reached the far corners of a room. Ice formed on the inside of windows, a glistening lacework that children would trace with numb fingers. Imagine waking before dawn in a one-room dwelling shared by 6 or 7 souls. Your breath clouds the air. The walls drip with condensation. You hear the creak of the neighbor's stairs and the faint coughs of another family below. The only water comes from a communal pump at the corner of the street, and by midwinter it freezes, leaving residents to break the ice with a hammer before filling their buckets. The city's layout made things worse. Narrow alleys, courts and yards, trapped cold air like bowls. Dampness soaked up from the ground, and the lack of sunlight meant that clothes never quite dried. Mold thrived. The cold did not simply bite, it settled in bones, lungs, and bricks. In the wealthier districts, things were scarcely better, though hidden under velvet curtains and heavier draperies. Coal smoke entered even the drawing rooms of the elite. Soot coated every surface. The fine gowns of society ladies would yellow after a single outing. Parlours required constant cleaning. London housemaids developed a particular rhythm: dust, wipe, polish, repeat, only to find that by nightfall, the surfaces were black again. The cold accentuated the class divide. For the rich, winter was a season of glittering balls and carriage rides, the clatter of hooves over frosted cobbles, fur-lined cloaks, and roaring hearths. For the poor, it meant hunger. Workhouses filled quickly in the winter months. Casual labour dried up, especially for dockers and builders. Street sellers who relied on foot traffic struggled to survive when people avoided the outdoors altogether. Newspapers from the 1850s frequently published grim statistics: children found frozen in doorways, the elderly succumbing to exposure, and deaths from bronchitis or pneumonia rising sharply between November and March. Doctors called it the London winter disease season. And yet, in the midst of all this, life went on, tediously, stubbornly. Milkmen still made their rounds before dawn, their carts rattling through slush. Chimney sweeps, blackened and coughing, clambered over icy rooftops. Costermongers, the street vendors who sold everything from oranges to shoe polish, trudged through the fog with pushcarts, calling out their wares in hoarse voices. You might think of London as a place of grandeur, but in winter it was a city of endurance. Even the simple act of lighting a fire was a ritual of patience. The matches were temperamental, and the coal needed kindling and paper to catch. Many families used old newspapers or scraps of wood scavenged from the streets. The first wisp of smoke curling from a chimney was a small triumph, a sign that the household had managed to fight back, at least for another day. The architecture of the time didn't help. Most houses were built with thin brick walls and poor insulation. The fashionable high ceilings of the Victorian middle class only trapped the heat far above the heads of those who needed it most. Even in the grand homes of Bloomsbury, it was common to see residents sitting by the fire wrapped in shawls or blankets, sipping weak tea, and watching their breath in the cold morning light. Public spaces offered little relief. The omnibuses, horse-drawn buses, were open to the wind, their passengers hunched and shivering under layers of wool. The gas lamps flickered weakly, casting long, shifting shadows on the slick pavements. The Thames itself, swollen with runoff and industrial waste, emitted a foul steam that mingled with the ever-present fog. The poor often resorted to communal fires, makeshift braziers set up in alleys or near markets, where strangers gathered, hands outstretched, sharing silence and smoke. A penny could buy a ladle of thin soup, a slice of bread, or a mug of warm beer. For many, that was the difference between surviving the night and not. Charitable societies did their best. Soup kitchens opened under church eaves. The ragged schools offered warm porridge to children before their morning lessons. But the demand far exceeded the supply. The city's population, swollen by migration from the countryside, had surpassed 2 million. The Industrial Revolution had created jobs, but it had also created dependency. On wages, on coal, on systems that failed when the weather turned. And in those months, it often felt as if the city itself conspired against the human spirit. The endless grey sky pressed low over the rooftops. The river smelled of rot. The bells of St. Paul's echoed faintly through the damp air, but even their chime seemed subdued. Yet within this bleakness, there was a strange rhythm, a routine of quiet resilience. Women washed clothes in near-freezing water, then hung them inside where they'd steam and drip for days. Men patched boots with bits of old leather or newspaper. Children played in the soot, streaked snow, their laughter muffled but persistent. The city adapted. It always did. But underneath the surface of ordinary endurance, a new problem was brewing, one invisible yet deadly. The smog that hung over the city was not merely unpleasant, it was toxic. As coal consumption increased through the 1840s and 1850s, so did respiratory illness. By the end of the decade, physicians began to suspect that the London fog was slowly killing thousands each year. Still, little was done. The idea that air could itself be a poison was too abstract, too unsettling. The government debated, committees were formed, reports were written, and the smoke continued to rise. And so, the winters came and went, each one leaving its thin layer of soot on the city's skin, its cough in the lungs of its people. The Victorians prided themselves on progress. Railways, factories, empire. But beneath the grandeur, millions faced each winter as a test of endurance against the cold, the smoke, and the dark. If you could stand now, in the middle of a London street in 1852, and listen closely, past the hiss of the gas lamps and the clatter of hooves, you would hear a deeper sound, the slow, constant rhythm of survival, the coughs of children, the scrape of coal shovels, the dripping of thawing gutters. Life small and stubborn, persisting in a city wrapped in its own smoke. But what happens when the cold itself turns deadly? When the city's air grows so thick that people begin to die not from frost, but from the very act of breathing? That, as you'll soon discover, was the next stage of London's brutal winter history. By the 1860s, London had become both the pride and the punishment of the industrial world. It was the capital of an empire that stretched across continents. But within its own streets, the winter air thickened into something more sinister than mere fog. You can imagine it now. A morning in December, the hour just after dawn. The city is still half asleep. The faint glow of gas lamps struggles against a murky, yellow-brown mist that hangs low over the rooftops. The lamps are only pinpricks in the gloom. From somewhere nearby comes the steady clang of a blacksmith's hammer, muted by the air, and the deep, hollow sound of a steamboat's horn on the Thames. This was no ordinary fog. It was what Londoners had begun to call the super, a mixture of coal smoke, moisture, and soot so thick that you could barely see your own hands. The fog turned the light of the lamps into weak, trembling halos. Horses stumbled in the streets. Drivers called out warnings into the darkness. Pedestrians carried small torches or lanterns to find their way, and still they collided with one another, coughing and blinking through the stinging haze. It was not unusual for entire days to pass without the sun being visible. Diaries from the time describe afternoons that looked like twilight, and twilights that fell into a kind of suffocating night. The fogs were not merely atmospheric curiosities. They were events. They shut down traffic, halted deliveries, and trapped people indoors for days. And yet there was no great outcry, no panic. Londoners had lived with coal smoke for so long that it had become part of the city's character. There were even postcards and poems about the romance of the London fog, as though it were a quaint charm rather than a public health disaster. Painters like James McNeill Whistler and, later, Claude Monet found inspiration in the city's hazy glow. They painted the Thames in misty yellows and greys, capturing its melancholy beauty, but never the smell, never the sting in the throat, never the taste of soot on the tongue. Behind that aesthetic veneer, the reality was much bleaker. By 1860, the population of London had surpassed 3 million. The number of chimneys, domestic and industrial, had multiplied beyond counting. Factories in the East End belched smoke day and night. Locomotives puffed black clouds from the new railway stations at Paddington, Euston, and Waterloo. Even the street lamps were fed by coal gas. The air was thick with the byproducts of progress. Every breath carried traces of sulfur dioxide, carbon, and tar. People wiped their noses and found black residue on their handkerchiefs. Curtains yellowed within weeks. Plants withered indoors. Parrots, popular among the upper classes, often died within months, their delicate lungs unable to cope with the pollution. Doctors began to notice patterns. In the coldest months, deaths from bronchitis and pneumonia doubled. Hospital wards filled with coughing men and children. Autopsies revealed lungs darkened by soot, even in those who had never worked in factories or mines. But Victorian medicine was still ruled by the theory of miasma, the belief that disease came from bad smells and corrupted air, not from microscopic organisms. Ironically, they were not entirely wrong. The air itself was killing people, but they misunderstood the mechanism. As a result, reforms focused on sanitation and odor, not on emissions. The government poured money into improving sewers, a success in its own right, but little was done to limit smoke. In fact, the very idea of restricting coal burning seemed absurd. Coal was the foundation of everything: warmth, light, transportation, and industry. Without it, London would have frozen. And so, the winter fogs continued. The poorest suffered the most. Their homes were cramped, unventilated and damp. Their fireplaces often lacked chimneys tall enough to draw smoke properly, so the soot hung inside, clinging to ceilings and lungs alike. Cheap coal was high in sulfur. It burned poorly but produced more smoke. In some homes, a single fire had to heat the entire family, cooking, drying clothes, boiling water for washing, and keeping out the cold. A report from 1871 described streets of people with faces the color of dust. Another noted that the air is such that one cannot distinguish the river from the road. The fog became a regular part of the city's rhythm. People adjusted. Policemen carried whistles to signal their presence. Theatres cancelled performances when audiences couldn't find their way. Cab drivers memorized routes by touch and habit, counting turns in the dark. There were accidents too. Horses fell into the Thames, misjudging the edge of the embankment. Trains collided in the murk. Fires went unnoticed until they were already roaring out of control. Thieves and pickpockets thrived, slipping through the haze unseen. The newspapers printed stories of men who vanished into the fog and were never found again. But for most Londoners, the worst part was not the danger. It was the suffocating monotony of it. Days blurred together in shades of brown and grey. The soot coated everything: books, dishes, even bread left out too long. Housewives scrubbed endlessly, knowing it was futile. Tailors and milliners complained that customers no longer wanted light, coloured clothing. The city had adapted to the grime. For those in power, the situation was viewed with detached pragmatism. A foggy day in London was treated as a natural phenomenon like rain or frost. When the fogs grew particularly bad, shutting down Parliament or delaying the mail, officials expressed concern, but always briefly. Then they returned to business as usual. Yet by the 1880s, the city's physicians had begun to suspect something more profound. Statistical studies, a relatively new field at the time, revealed a clear pattern. Every major fog event corresponded with a spike in death rates. The poorest districts suffered most, but even the wealthy were not immune. Dr. Arthur Farr, one of the early public health statisticians, wrote grimly in 1883, "The fog is the colour of death. It is not weather but poison." But still, the city kept burning coal. The furnaces roared on. To live in London during those winters was to accept a strange kind of compromise. The very fuel that gave you warmth also made you cough. The fires that kept frost from your bones filled your lungs with soot. The same industry that gave the city its prosperity ensured that its air remained toxic. Imagine walking home after dusk through the fog of 1887. You might be returning from a long day in a counting house or a seamstress's workshop. The air is so thick that your world shrinks to a few feet. Gas lamps glow like moons floating in the dark. Each step feels uncertain. You listen for the sound of hooves or wheels to guide your path. You can smell everything: the tanneries, the breweries, the stables, all mixed into a single sour scent that clings to your clothes. Some Londoners found strange beauty in it. The poet Robert Bridges called it the melancholy veil of our great Babylon. But others could only think of survival. For every person who wrote about the fog's mystery, hundreds more sat coughing in dark rooms, counting out pennies for the next scuttle of coal. and through it all the city grew. By 1890, London's population had surpassed 4.5 million. The suburbs expanded outward, connected by railways that pumped even more smoke into the sky. The fogs became a recurring feature of city life, sometimes light and transient, other times so dense that day and night merged. There was one such winter in 1873, when the fog lasted nearly a week. The city slowed to a crawl. Shopkeepers burned lamps in their windows all day. At Charing Cross, trains arrived covered in soot, their passengers black-faced and coughing. The newspapers called it the Black Week. Death rates doubled. Still, when the air cleared, life simply resumed. London had learned to forget quickly. But these long, dark winters were doing something else too, something deeper and less visible. They were shaping the modern consciousness of the city. The endless soot, the grime, the weary endurance. All of it seeped into London's culture, its literature, its art. Dickens' descriptions of murky streets, Sherlock Holmes' gas-lit investigations, the Gothic gloom of late Victorian architecture, all were born from this atmosphere of perpetual twilight. Even the rhythm of daily life changed. People woke later, moved slower, and huddled indoors longer. The fog dictated behavior as much as the clock. It was a season not just of cold, but of introspection, when everything seemed wrapped in shadow and time itself felt heavier. Still, progress marched on. Electric lighting began to appear in wealthier districts. Steam heating was discussed, though rarely adopted. Engineers dreamed of cleaner fuels, but coal was cheap, and the empire depended on it. Every ton burned in London meant profit for a mine in Wales or Newcastle. To abandon coal would have meant to challenge the foundation of Britain's power. So the fogs remained. Familiar, tolerated, and deadly. And when the sun finally broke through, after days of darkness, it revealed a city glazed with soot, the stone facades of Westminster and St. Paul's turned from pale cream to permanent grey. Londoners themselves seemed to share that coloration. Their coats, their faces, even their spirits dimmed by the endless smoke. It would take decades before the city faced the truth, before the smog grew so thick, and the death toll so high, that denial was no longer possible. But that reckoning was still in the future. For now, in the winters of the late Victorian age, London continued to breathe in its own fumes, and to call the poison progress. And as the lamps flickered weakly through another fog-bound evening, one might wonder, how bad would it have to get before anyone truly cared? The story of London's winters is not a story of sudden catastrophe, but of slow accumulation. Decade after decade, layer upon layer, soot settled over the city like sediment at the bottom of a stagnant pond. What began in the 1840s as an inconvenience had, by the turn of the 20th century, become an enduring condition of life, the grey companion of every winter, and yet Londoners adapted. That was the most extraordinary part. By 1900, the city's population had surpassed 6 million, and nearly every one of them accepted the fog as a fact of nature, as immovable as the tides. The newspapers printed daily fog reports. The smoke days were noted in diaries beside the weather. Playwrights timed their premieres to avoid them. Even the police had special fog duty protocols, deploying constables at busy intersections with whistles and lanterns to guide carriages, and later, motorcars through the gloom. But beneath this veneer of routine, something was beginning to change. The city had grown noisier, more electric, more mechanical. The familiar horses were being replaced by engines that coughed out even more soot and smoke. Factories multiplied, power stations appeared, and new forms of industry filled the air with invisible toxins the Victorians had never known. The fog was no longer just coal and moisture. It was chemical. The 1900s smoke as a way of life for many Londoners at the dawn of the new century. The fog was even a point of identity. It was their fog, the emblem of London's mystery and modernity. Tourists expected it, poets praised it. There were postcards showing the Houses of Parliament half lost in mist, and travel writers spoke of the city's golden haze. But those who lived through it knew better. Housewives scrubbed black grime from their curtains, from their lungs. Children suffered from chronic bronchitis so common it had a nickname, London cough. Laundry businesses took in soot-stained sheets and returned them not quite white, but London clean, a faint grey acceptable by local standards. Every winter the same ritual unfolded. Fires lit, the fog rolled in, and the air thickened until even electric lights could barely pierce it. The familiar pea super smell, sharp, metallic, slightly oily, filled homes and streets alike. Inside, people spoke in low voices, as though sound itself were dulled by the weight of the air. The city's infrastructure, once hailed as modern marvels, struggled under the invisible burden. gas lights flickered out. Trains crept along at walking pace. The new motor omnibuses, early symbols of progress, often had to stop altogether when visibility dropped below a few feet. Policemen guided them by walking in front, handkerchiefs tied over their mouths. And still, life went on. The 1910s, 1930s, the fog of empire during the First World War. London's relationship with smoke took on a darker symbolism. The great industrial cities of Britain were praised for their smoky effort. Their factories working day and night to supply the front. Posters depicted plumes of factory smoke as a sign of patriotism, progress, sacrifice, production. To criticize the smoke was to criticize victory itself. After the war, during the 1920s and 30s, the fog returned with renewed strength. Londoners had more chimneys than ever before, and now automobiles added their fumes to the mix. The Air Pollution Research Committee was formed in 1920, but its reports were mild, bureaucratic, and largely ignored. By then, the phrase London particular had entered the lexicon. A grim little joke, borrowed from soup recipes, meaning a fog so thick you could cut it with a knife. Shops sold mock souvenirs called bottled London fog, sealed jars of grey air that tourists bought as novelties. It was a sign of how normalised the disaster had become. The city was breathing poison and calling it character. Still, the harm accumulated. Hospitals continued to record spikes in deaths from respiratory illness every winter. Children wheezed through school days. The elderly rarely survived the colder months, but the connection between smoke and health was rarely discussed openly. The fog was the London season, not a public emergency, and yet the warning signs were all there, in medical journals, in municipal reports, in the endless wiping of soot from windowsills. The question was not if the city would face a reckoning, but when. The winter of 1952, it came suddenly, and it came late. By December 1952, London had changed enormously from the world of Dickens and gas lamps. Electric lights glowed from every window. Double-decker buses roamed the streets. The last vestiges of Victorian London had faded, and yet, in one crucial way, the city had not moved on at all. It still burned coal. The winter of 1952 was colder than usual. In early December, a high-pressure system settled over southern England, trapping cold air near the ground. Londoners, seeking warmth, stoked their fireplaces higher than ever. Across the city, millions of chimneys poured out dense smoke. Meanwhile, the new power stations on the river burned low-grade coal to meet post-war energy demands, belching vast quantities of sulfur into the stagnant air. On December 5th, the wind dropped. By the evening of December 6th, the fog had thickened into something no one could remember seeing before. It was not the yellow mist of the past. This was darker, heavier, oily to the touch. It rolled down the streets like liquid. Bus drivers abandoned their vehicles, unable to see the road. People groped along walls to find their way home. Theatres closed. Ambulances crawled through the streets, headlights swallowed by the dark. By December 7th, visibility had fallen to just a few feet. Even indoors, the air was hazy. The fog seeped through cracks in windows and under doors. In hospitals, doctors found that oxygen tanks made little difference. The air itself was too thick to breathe. The smell was unforgettable, a sharp, acid tang that burned the throat and stung the eyes. It was as if you were breathing through a wool blanket soaked in vinegar. One survivor recalled decades later. And still, life continued. Londoners, so accustomed to fog, assumed it would clear in a day or two. They went to work, they shopped, they tried to carry on. It did not clear. For 5 days, the city was paralysed under a pall of its own making. Trains stopped. Theatres shut down. Cattle in the Smithfield market suffocated in their pens. The undertakers ran out of coffins. Hospitals filled beyond capacity. People arriving gasping for breath, coughing up black mucus, collapsing in the streets. The newspapers called it simply the Great Smog. When the winds finally returned on December 9th, the fog lifted and revealed a catastrophe. In the days that followed, officials estimated that around 4,000 people had died. Later studies, more complete and honest, suggested the number was closer to 12,000. Tens of thousands more were left with permanent lung damage. It was the deadliest air pollution event in modern history, and yet even then, the initial response was muted. The British government, embarrassed, downplayed the event. A period of fog, they called it, as though it were a passing weather inconvenience. The word, smog, itself carried no official recognition. But doctors, scientists, and ordinary citizens knew what they had lived through. The myth of the harmless London fog had finally died. The turning point in the years that followed, something began to shift. Public outrage grew. Newspapers published the grim statistics. Photographs showed the city vanishing into darkness. Survivors told stories of finding their way by touch, of seeing the fog inside their homes. Parliament could no longer ignore it. In 1956, after long debate, the Clean Air Act was passed. It restricted coal burning, created smokeless zones, and promoted cleaner fuels like gas and electricity. It was not an overnight fix. The city still shivered through winters, and traces of smog lingered for decades. But gradually, year by year, the skies lightened. The soot faded from the stonework. For the first time in over a century, Londoners could see the stars in winter. And yet, even in cleaner air, the memory of those old winters lingered. The London fog became a symbol not just of pollution, but of endurance, of a city that had lived for generations under its own shadow and survived. The texture of the past, if you were to walk through London today, you might find it hard to imagine what those winters were like. The buildings are clean, the air crisp, the streetlights shine clearly through the drizzle. But look closely, at the blackened corners of an old church, at the soot still embedded in carved stone, and you will see the ghosts of those seasons. The Victorians, for all their invention and progress, lived in a world perpetually dimmed by their own success. The coal that powered their empire also cloaked their city. The warmth that comforted them slowly poisoned them, and the fog that gave London its mystique almost killed it. But perhaps, in that slow suffocation, there was also something profoundly human. The stubborn refusal to surrender, the ability to endure even when the air itself turned against you. For a century, Londoners went about their business in a half-lit world, coughing and cleaning, joking and persevering. They built lives, wrote books, fell in love, and dreamed beneath skies the color of ash. And when at last the smoke began to lift, they stepped blinking into the light, as if waking from a long, grim sleep. The city they had built, blackened but unbroken, stood as a monument to the strange resilience of ordinary life. So if you ever find yourself wandering the quiet streets of London on a cold winter night, and you catch the faint smell of coal from some forgotten chimney, imagine those long winters, the frost, the fog, the steady rhythm of endurance, and remember that the air you breathe, clear and cold, was bought with the lives of thousands who once breathed smoke. History often moves not with thunder, but with coughs. And in London, for more than 100 years, winter never simply meant cold. It meant survival. You wake before dawn to the sound of bells. They ring faintly, their rhythm slow and deliberate, echoing across the stone walls of a monastery somewhere in England, or perhaps France, or northern Italy. It hardly matters. For the medieval scribe, the life was largely the same no matter the kingdom, quiet, repetitive, and steeped in the discipline of ink and time. The air is cold. Your breath clouds as you sit up from a straw-filled mattress. The cell is bare, a cot, a stool, a small wooden cross above a narrow window. Outside, the courtyard is still dark. The only light comes from the moon and a few guttering candles along the cloister walk. You pull your wool robe tighter, the coarse fabric scratching at your neck, and you make your way toward the chapel for matins, the first of the day's prayers. This is the rhythm of your life, repeated endlessly. Prayer, work, silence. In between those hours of devotion, you perform your sacred labor copying texts one word at a time on sheets of parchment that have been prepared by other patient hands. The year might be 1142, or 1185, or 1210. The centuries blur because the life of the scribe changed little over that long medieval span. It was not a life of glory, nor of wealth. It was a life of waiting, for light, for ink to dry, for meaning to emerge slowly from the curve of each letter. The workshop of silence, the scriptorium, the writing room, was the quietest place in the monastery, save perhaps the chapel. To enter it was to step into a world of faint scratching and the smell of ink. Long wooden desks lined the walls, angled upward so that the scribes could write without hunching too deeply. Each desk had a small shelf for ink pots, a knife for trimming quills, and a piece of pumice stone to smooth the surface of the parchment. The light came from narrow windows, high and arched, facing east to catch the morning sun. Candles and oil lamps were discouraged. They flickered, and their smoke stained the manuscripts. So, most of the year, scribes worked by whatever daylight they could find. In winter, the days were painfully short. The work often stopped early, not for lack of will, but for lack of visibility. You sit at your desk. Before you lies a sheet of parchment, pale and uneven, its surface faintly greasy. It has been scraped clean of its animal origins, once a sheepskin or goatskin, now stretched and dried until thin as paper. You can still smell it, a faint tang of hide and chalk. It crackles slightly under your hand. Your tools are few, a quill cut from the flight feather of a goose or swan. a penknife for sharpening the nib, an inkwell made of horn or clay, filled with black or brown ink brewed from oak galls, iron salts, and gum arabic. The ink stains everything it touches, your fingers, your robes, sometimes even your thoughts. You dip the quill, you breathe, then you begin. Each letter is a construction. Every curve, every flourish must be precise. The rhythm is slow, almost hypnotic. Downstroke, lift, curve, pause. The sound of many pens working together becomes a kind of soft rain across the room. You are not creating something new. You are preserving something old, a fragment of scripture, a commentary by a long dead theologian, perhaps even a copy of a Roman text rescued from decay. You copy what has been copied countless times before, your duty not to invent but to ensure that nothing is lost. It is said that in some monasteries, the scribes considered their work a form of prayer. Each word written carefully was a devotion, each finished page an offering to God. And in a way, it was true. The act required patience, humility, and discipline, virtues the monks were trained to cultivate. But it was also hard. The cold bit at your fingers, ink froze in winter, parchment stiffened. Mistakes were difficult to correct. There was no erasing, only scraping gently with a knife and hoping not to tear the skin. Some scribes left faint notes in the margins of manuscripts, small bursts of humanity in an otherwise silent world. Oh, my hand is weary. This parchment is thin. Thank God it will soon be dark. You can still see those complaints, centuries later, preserved in neat Latin script. The materials of eternity. Few outside the monastery ever saw the full labor behind a book. Each one represented months, sometimes years, of effort, not only by the scribes but by tanners, illuminators, binders, and carvers. Before you even set pen to parchment, someone had to prepare the animal's skins. They were soaked in lime to loosen the hair, then scraped and stretched on wooden frames. Each sheet had to be dried and rubbed smooth with pumice. Only then could lines be ruled with lead or ink to guide your writing. A skilled scribe could tell from the touch whether a page came from a sheep or a goat, whether it would absorb ink well or blot. The ink itself was alchemy. Oak galls, those knobby swellings found on oak trees, were crushed and mixed with iron sulfate, creating a deep black fluid that darkened further as it aged. The smell was sharp, earthy, slightly metallic. Some monasteries added secret ingredients: wine, vinegar, honey, even soot. And then there was the quill, the simplest and most personal tool of all. Each scribe shaped his own nib with care, adjusting the angle to match his handwriting. A good quill could last a week, a poor one only an hour. When you read a medieval manuscript today, every letter bears the mark of that individual hand. Tiny variations in pressure, small imperfections in the line. They are the heartbeat of the human behind the page. The weight of words, the texts copied in those cold rooms varied widely. Bibles, of course, the central labor of most scriptoria, but also sermons, saints' lives, psalters, legal codes, and the works of classical authors that had somehow survived the collapse of Rome. Sometimes the scribes copied in Latin they scarcely understood. They followed the words mechanically, trusting that meaning would follow form. Others were scholars in their own right, carefully comparing versions, noting differences in the margins. You might imagine the monotony, hours spent on a single passage, a single column of text, the silence broken only by the scratch of pens, the sigh of a shifting stool, the faint rustle of robes. Outside, the wind might howl through the cloister, or rain tap softly on the glassless windows. Inside, nothing moved but the quills. And yet, in this tedium, something astonishing was happening. The very survival of knowledge depended on it. Every page copied was a rescue from oblivion. Without those patient, half-frozen monks, much of the ancient world, Aristotle, Virgil, Cicero, would have vanished entirely. The work was slow, yes, but not meaningless. Every dot of ink was a bridge across centuries. Every line written was a small defiance against time itself. Between silence and sound after hours of writing, the bell rang again. Sext, the midday prayer. You stretch your fingers, stiff from the quill. The world beyond the cloister seems distant. The fields, the villages, the wars. You eat a small meal in silence, bread, perhaps a bowl of lentils, a mug of thin ale. Then, after prayer, you return to your desk. The light now comes from the south, facing windows. It's weak but enough. You resume your work, eyes tired, but the rhythm returns, the quiet cadence of letters, the endless unfolding of thought. In some scriptoria, a corrector walked among the desks, checking the work of the scribes. His job was to catch errors, a misplaced line, a skipped word, a letter smudged by haste. The best correctors had reputations almost as feared as abbots. Their red ink marked shame on the page, but their corrections preserved the integrity of the text. every mistake mattered. A single omitted word could alter a sentence of scripture. A forgotten knot could turn a warning into a command. Accuracy was salvation. When the day finally ended and the candlelight began to fade, the scribes laid their quills aside. Their hands trembled slightly. They flexed their fingers, wiped their eyes. Then, they closed the books, covered the ink pots, and filed silently out. Outside, the cold deepened. The bell for Compline, the night prayer, called them once more. In the dormitory, under thin blankets, they would sleep, dreamless, exhausted, already waiting for the next dawn's labor. And so it went, day after day, year after year. A life without recognition. Few scribes were known by name. The books they created often bore no signature. They did not seek fame, their reward was endurance. Yet sometimes, in the margins of ancient manuscripts, you can still find small traces of individuality. Pray for the writer of this book. As the harbour welcomes the sailor, so the last line welcomes the scribe. This parchment is hairy. Those small jokes, those complaints and sighs, are the whispers of real people living quiet lives in a world that barely noticed them. Their names are forgotten, but their work endures. And as you turn the pages of any medieval manuscript today, the ink still dark, the parchment still pliant, you touch the labour of hands that once trembled in the cold of a stone scriptorium somewhere 8 centuries ago. But what happens when the outside world begins to change? When the demand for books grows beyond what human hands can supply? When the patient rhythm of the quill meets the restless energy of a new age? The scriptorium is no longer the quiet monopoly it once was. The 12th and 13th centuries had been ages of cloistered learning, but by the mid-13th, the world beyond the monastery walls had begun to stir. Cities grew, markets hummed. The old silence of the abbey met the noise of trade, argument, and curiosity. Knowledge was no longer confined to monks and priests. It was spilling into the streets, into universities, guild halls, and royal courts. And with it came the most dangerous of all requests for the humble scribe: more work. The book trade awakens. Imagine walking through Paris in 1270. The streets near the University of Paris smell faintly of parchment and ink. Everywhere, scholars and students crowd under eaves and into narrow shops where books are bought, borrowed, and copied. The stationers, early dealers in manuscripts, have begun to organize this new trade. They supply sheets of parchment, quills, and ink to hired scribes who work not in monasteries, but in small workshops above taverns or behind churches. The scribe's world has changed. The labor is still slow, but the silence has broken. You can hear it, the scrape of many pens, the murmur of conversation, the crackle of fires in iron braziers keeping ink from freezing in the Parisian winter. Scribes talk now. They argue about payment, about the quality of parchment, about the unfairness of stationers who sell their work for double its worth. A single Bible might require months, even years of labor. But the university demands copies of Aristotle, commentaries by Averroes, textbooks of logic, grammar, and law. The work never ends, and for the first time in centuries, the scribe is a professional, a tradesman of words. You might find him working late into the night, a candle flickering dangerously close to parchment, his fingers stained black. He pauses only to wet his quill, flex his wrist, and whisper to himself the words he writes in Latin or French. He is no monk now, but a craftsman, underpaid, anonymous, and utterly necessary. The craft and the chain. As the medieval university system grew, so did the infrastructure around it. There were now organized methods to produce books. The piscia system. Under this arrangement, a master copy of a text was divided into sections or piscia, each one lent out to different scribes. Multiple copies could be produced simultaneously, each scribe working on a separate piscia and then returning it for the next borrower. It was, in a way, an early form of mass production, not mechanized, but efficient. Imagine the movement of these pages through the city. A section of Aristotle's Ethics carried in a leather pouch from a university library to a scribe's bench, copied carefully, then returned to the stationer to be replaced with another. A chain of hands, each one leaving its faint mark. A slightly different angle of script, a variation in ink darkness, a small slip corrected in the margin. The system brought new speed, but it also brought anxiety. Errors multiplied. Scholars complained of corrupt texts, yet there was no going back. The appetite for books was growing too fast, and human hands could barely keep pace. For the scribes themselves, the work was steady but hard. Many lived in rented rooms above shops. Their furniture was simple: a desk, a stool, perhaps a chest to store completed work. Parchment dust covered everything. Their eyes ached from squinting. Their backs grew crooked from long hours bent over the page. Sometimes, to lighten the tedium, they doodled. Margins of manuscripts from this period are alive with small, whimsical sketches, rabbits jesting with snails, monks chasing geese, cats licking inkpots. Humor crept into the most serious texts. It was, perhaps, a quiet rebellion against the monotony of perfection. Ink, wealth, and the written word. By 1300, books had become a visible sign of wealth. Nobles commissioned illuminated manuscripts, psalters, books of hours, romances. They were luxury items bound in leather, adorned with gold leaf and vivid pigments. The production of these books required collaboration between several craftspeople: the scribe who wrote the text, the illuminator who painted the initials and borders, the binder who finished the work. In large cities like Paris, Florence, and London, workshops employed dozens of artisans, each specializing in one part of the process. It was no longer merely a spiritual labor. It was commerce. The scribe who once copied the Gospels for God now copied them for a merchant's wife, who desired a personal prayer book with her initials painted in lapis lazuli. The ink was still the same mixture of oak, gall, and iron, but the motivation behind it had shifted, from devotion to patronage. The illuminator's paints came from faraway lands: ultramarine from Afghanistan, vermilion from cinnabar mines in Spain, and green earth from Italy. Each pigment was ground and mixed with egg yolk or gum arabic, applied delicately with brushes made from squirrel hair. When the book was finished, it gleamed like treasure. But for the scribe, whose name might not even appear within, the pay was modest. A few coins per quire, enough for food and rent, but rarely for comfort. And still, the orders came. Nobles wanted chronicles of their families. Scholars wanted commentaries. The church wanted copies of decrees. The scribe's hand became the engine of the written world. The slow birth of paper in the 14th century, another quiet revolution began, one that would alter the balance of labor forever. Paper. Unlike parchment, paper did not require flocks of sheep or herds of goats. It was made from rags, linen and cotton scraps beaten to pulp and pressed into sheets. It was cheaper, lighter, and faster to produce. At first, scholars distrusted it. Paper seemed fragile, unworthy of sacred or official texts. But as its quality improved and its cost advantage grew undeniable, it began to spread across Europe. Paper mills appeared in Italy, then in France and Germany. By 1350, even conservative scribes had begun to use it for draft copies and less formal documents. For the professional scribe, it was both a gift and a warning. Paper meant more work could be done more cheaply, but it also meant the craft was becoming less exclusive. Anyone with access to a ream of paper and ink could now copy texts. The barrier between professional and amateur was thinning. Still, the most beautiful manuscripts, those meant for royalty or the church, remained on parchment. The soft sheen, the durability, the weight in the hand, these things could not yet be imitated by humble paper. A nobleman wanted a book that would last a lifetime. And so for a while, both materials coexisted, the old and the new bound together in uneasy partnership. The human cost of knowledge, to work as a scribe, was to live within the tension between preservation and exhaustion. The pace of production increased, but the hours did not. Some scribes wrote contracts binding them to complete a certain number of pages per week, under penalty of lost pay or worse. Others found themselves in debt to stationers for supplies, ink, parchment, even quills. They worked by candlelight until their vision blurred. Ink stained their nails permanently black. Their fingertips developed calluses from constant pressure. Some developed what modern medicine might call repetitive strain injuries. They described it simply as cramp in the hand of the writer, and yet through it all they persisted, because the alternative was silence. To stop writing was to stop transmitting thought. The scribe's life was hard, but it was meaningful in a world where words were power, a world ready for revolution. By the early 15th century, whispers began to spread through the book trade. In Mainz, in Strasbourg, in other towns along the Rhine, there were rumors of men experimenting with metal letters, movable, reusable pieces that could form words without the need for endless handwriting. Most scribes dismissed the talk as folly. Machines could not replace the art of the pen. No contraption could match the elegance of a hand-drawn letter or the devotion of a page illuminated by human care. But the rumors persisted. They spoke of presses, of ink thick as tar, of sheets pressed together in iron frames. A few adventurous stationers traveled to Germany to see for themselves, returning home with uneasy excitement. Something was changing. The scribe, who for 1,000 years had been the vessel of knowledge, was about to face extinction, though he did not yet know it. For now, the world continued as before. In the quiet workshops of Paris, Florence, and Bruges, the scratching of quills still filled the air. The The smell of parchment still clung to every hand. The words still flowed, one letter at a time. But somewhere in a workshop by the Rhine, a man named Johannes Gutenberg was testing a new kind of ink. A blacker, thicker ink that would not fade. He adjusted the pressure of his press, checked the alignment of his movable type, and pulled a lever. The future of writing shifted with that sound, a small, metallic click. What would happen to the scribes when the printed page arrived? When speed replaced patience, and the work of many hands could be done by one machine? Would their world vanish overnight, or would the old habits of ink and silence endure in some hidden way? The year is 1455. The workshop smells not of parchment and candle wax, but of oil, iron, and wet ink. The air is heavy with the sound of movement, the creak of wood, the hiss of press plates, the murmuring of apprentices. On a sturdy table lies something new, a page, freshly printed. The letters are dark, sharp, uniform. Each line perfectly straight, each margin exact. It is the Gutenberg Bible, one of the first great printed works of the Western world. And with it, the long age of the hand, copied book begins to fade into memory. The machine that changed the quiet for over 1,000 years, every word in every book had been shaped by human hands. One letter, one stroke, one breath at a time. The scribe had been both tool and artist, a guardian of thought in an age of silence. But now that silence was breaking. Gutenberg's press transformed the act of copying into a mechanical rhythm. A frame held small metal letters, movable type, each representing a single character. The type was arranged into words, coated in thick ink, and pressed onto paper with even pressure. The result was astonishing. Dozens of identical pages could be produced in a single day, each as precise as the last. Where once a monastery of scribes might take a year to produce one Bible, a printing press could create hundreds. It was not only speed that changed the world, but the nature of the written word itself. The printed page was consistent, no errors from tired hands, no smudged letters or uneven lines. It was democratic in its perfection. For the first time, knowledge could be reproduced not by devotion, but by design. The vanishing of the quill for the scribes, the change came slowly at first. At monasteries in England, Italy, and the Low Countries, the sound of quills scratching across parchment continued for decades after the printing press was born. Some abbots saw the new technology as a curiosity, others as a threat. A few tried to ignore it entirely. The printed book, one abbot wrote in the 1470s, will never equal the beauty of that written by the human hand. He was right, in a sense. The press could not replicate the elegant curves of a master scribe's Gothic script, or the subtle flourishes that made each manuscript unique. But it could do something the scribe never could. It could multiply. By 1500, more than 20 million printed books existed in Europe. The press spread like wildfire, from Mainz to Venice, from Paris to London. Printers became the new craftsmen of words, their workshops humming day and night. The professional scribe, once essential, found himself displaced. The demand for hand-copied texts dwindled. The great scriptoria of monasteries fell silent. The scribes who remained turned to specialized work, copying legal charters, certificates, letters of indulgence, or documents requiring the elegance of handwriting. Others became proofreaders for printers, comparing printed pages against manuscript originals, their eyes still trained for accuracy. But many simply faded from history, their trade extinguished by efficiency. The survivors of the craft, not all scribes, vanished quietly. Some adapted, joining the new world of printing as calligraphers, decorators, and designers of type. The earliest printed books, incunabula as they are now called, often imitated manuscripts. Printers left blank spaces for painted initials and used typefaces modeled after Gothic scripts. In these pages one can still see the shadow of the scribe's hand. In Venice, the printer Aldus Manutius hired former scribes to help design italic type, a style meant to condense text and resemble elegant handwriting. Their expertise in proportion and rhythm shaped the visual language of print for centuries. Even in decline, the scribes left their mark. In monasteries, some monks continued copying manuscripts long after the printing press became dominant. They saw it as an act of devotion, a way to honor God through labor rather than necessity. A few even copied printed books by hand, a strange, nostalgic reversal of progress. By the early 16th century, however, even these acts were rare. The scriptorium, once the beating heart of the monastery, became a relic. The desks gathered dust, the quills dried in their inkpots. Silence returned, not the sacred silence of work, but the quiet of absence. The democratization of the page, the printed word, spread faster than any invention before it. books became cheaper, smaller, and more accessible. Students could own texts instead of borrowing them. Merchants could read trade manuals. Preachers could circulate sermons. For centuries, scribes had been the gatekeepers of knowledge. Now, the gates were open. With print came both enlightenment and chaos. Ideas traveled further and faster, not always safely. Pamphlets attacked kings and popes. Translations of the Bible challenged authority. Martin Luther's 95 Theses spread across Europe within months, carried on the backs of printed pages that no scribe could have duplicated so quickly. The printed word became a weapon. The Reformation, the scientific revolution, the rise of literacy, all were built upon the bones of the old scribe's trade, and yet, somewhere in this whirlwind of change, the spirit of the scribe persisted. Because what had driven the medieval copyist was not just duty, but reverence, for words, for accuracy, for endurance. The press had changed the form, but not the function. Humanity still wrote, still copied, still sought permanence against the erosion of time. The hands that remembered in one manuscript copied around 1475, years after printing had begun. A wary scribe left a final note in the margin. His Latin is careful, but the sentiment is universal. The press will soon drive us all from our work. Yet no machine can love the letters as we do. It is a quiet farewell, not bitter, only resigned. He understood that progress was unstoppable, but he also knew that something intangible was being lost, the intimacy between mind and hand, between ink and intention. When you hold a medieval manuscript today, when you see the uneven strokes, the small corrections, the human warmth behind each curve, you touch that lost world. The printed page may speak to millions, but the handwritten one still whispers to you alone. Ink and memory. By the mid-16th century, the scribe as a profession had all but disappeared in Europe. But their influence lingered. The discipline of accurate copying evolved into new forms: editors, typesetters, proofreaders. The very layout of printed books, margins, columns, illuminations, came from scribal traditions. Even the word manuscript endured, reminding readers that every text once passed through human fingers. And in a curious way, the scribe's obsession with permanence had succeeded. The books they created, though few, often outlasted the early printed ones. Parchment, when cared for, can survive for 1,000 years. Many of those manuscripts still exist. Their ink dark, their letters crisp. They sit in libraries and archives, each page breathing faintly with the memory of a hand long gone. Sometimes, under the right light, you can still see the tiny impressions left by the quill's pressure. The ghost of movement, captured forever in skin. A return to silence. The last known monastic scriptorium closed quietly sometime in the late 1500s. The monks had no ceremony for it. There was no funeral for the quill. The desks were cleared, the tools put away, the remaining sheets of parchment stored in chests. The world had changed too completely for nostalgia to resist. Yet the rhythm of the scribe's life, slow, deliberate, contemplative, never truly vanished. It found new forms in scholars, archivists, and even in those who write by hand today. Because at its core, the scribe's labor was not just about transcription. It was about attention, to the shape of words, to the meaning of preservation, to the idea that something written carefully might endure forever. In an age of machines, that attention remains rare and precious. So when you imagine the medieval scribe at his desk, bent under cold light, fingers stained, lips moving silently as he copies the word amen, remember that you are looking at the beginning of all written endurance. Every book, every page, every screen you read now owes something to that patient devotion. The press may have silenced the scriptorium, but the ink never dried. It simply changed hands. Even now, as you close your eyes and drift towards sleep, imagine the faint sound of a quill scratching across parchment. Slow, steady, eternal. The world moves faster now, but somewhere in that rhythm, the patience of the scribe still lingers. You stand at dawn in Paris, not the romantic, polished Paris of boulevards and cafes, but the older one, crowded and uneven, its narrow streets already stirring with life. The year is 1723. The morning air is cool, heavy, and alive with odors that refuse to stay quiet. It smells of smoke, mud, yeast, horse sweat, refuse cabbage, and the faint sweetness of bread baking somewhere across the sign. It is a smell that belongs entirely to a living city, dense, ancient, and unwashed. The Paris of the early 18th century was a place of astonishing contrasts: grandeur and filth, faith and decay, music and rot. Behind the facades of palaces and churches lay a world of ordinary life, where tens of thousands of people crowded into tenements, cooked over smoky fires, emptied chamber pots into the street, and endured the slow accumulation of everything that a city produces and forgets to remove. It was, in short, a city that stank. And it would take a century of struggle, invention, and civic stubbornness to make it otherwise. The geography of stench. To understand 18th century Paris, you must first understand its geography of smells. The city was still largely medieval in structure, a maze of narrow lanes, overhanging houses, and open gutters running down the center of the street. These gutters, called caniveaux, carried rainwater, kitchen waste, and human waste alike. In summer, they dried into crusted filth. In winter, they overflowed. When it rained, the runoff swirled through the alleys, carrying with it every imaginable impurity, a slow, brown river of rot. Near Les Halles, the great central market, the air was thick with the scent of meat and fish, mingled with straw, dung, and sour milk. On the Island de la Cité, where the Hôtel Dieu hospital stood, one could smell illness itself, the sweet, heavy odor of bodies unwashed and wounds untreated. In the tanneries along the Bièvre River, the stench of hides soaked in urine and lime hung for miles. Even the Seine, once a source of water and pride, had become an open sewer. People drew drinking water from the same place where waste was dumped. The water was cloudy, often greenish, and always suspect. Paris was a city that fed upon itself and then quietly swallowed the remains. And yet, people lived, worked, and even thrived amid it all. The smell was part of life, unpleasant but expected, woven into the texture of existence like the tolling of bells or the clop of hooves on cobblestone. The night soil men, in the hours before dawn, before the city awoke, another world stirred, the world of the vidangeurs, the night soil men. Their task was simple, if grim, to empty the cesspits beneath houses and carry away the waste. Every building had one, a stone-lined pit below the courtyard or cellar, collecting years' worth of excrement and kitchen refuse. These pits were sometimes several meters deep and could go decades without being emptied. When they were, the process was both laborious and nauseating. The night soil men worked by lantern light. They descended into the pit using ropes, scooping and shoveling by hand into barrels. The air was suffocating. There were stories of men fainting and dying from the fumes, a mixture of methane, ammonia, and rot. When the barrels were full, they were sealed and carted out through the sleeping streets to be dumped in designated fields outside the city walls. It was dangerous, foul work, but it paid better than many trades. The vidangers were tolerated but avoided. Children mocked them. Adults stepped aside in silence as they passed. Yet without them, the city would drown in its own waste. The irony was that their cargo was valuable. Farmers outside Paris bought the collected waste as fertilizer. The refuse of the city nourished the countryside that in turn fed the city again. An unpleasant but perfect cycle of survival. The battle against smell was not merely an inconvenience, it was feared. For the people of 18th century Paris, bad air, miasma, was believed to cause disease. The plague fever and cholera were thought to spread through invisible clouds of corruption rising from filth. To breathe in stench was to risk death, and so, attempts to control odor became attempts to protect life. The earliest measures were primitive but earnest, perfuming the streets with incense, sprinkling vinegar in public places, or burning bundles of herbs near hospitals. During outbreaks, barrels of tar or sulfur were set alight, filling the air with smoke meant to purify. Doctors wore long masks stuffed with aromatic spices. Priests blessed wells. City officials ordered cesspits to be sealed or relocated, though enforcement was haphazard. Still, the growing awareness of hygiene marked a change. The city was beginning to think of itself not only as a collection of buildings, but as a living organism, one that could sicken and perhaps be cured. The water problem, paradoxically, was both the source and the solution to the city's filth. Paris had no modern sewage system. The Seine was both sink and source, carrying away waste but also supplying the city's drinking water. In wealthier neighborhoods, water carriers, porteurs d'eau, sold buckets drawn from upstream, carried through the streets on wooden yokes. Poorer districts relied on whatever they could find. Wells were often contaminated, especially near cemeteries or tanneries. When the water ran low in summer, tempers rose, women fought at fountains, arguments over water rights filled city council meetings. In 1737, one official wrote grimly that Paris will choke on its own thirst before it drowns in its filth. Efforts were made to improve supply. Engineers built wooden aqueducts, repaired old Roman conduits, and experimented with mechanical pumps along the Seine. These innovations were small steps toward the modern city, though few at the time could see how long the journey would be. Cleaning the streets, the city employed recleurs, street sweepers, to scrape the gutters and collect rubbish. Their tools were simple brooms of birch twigs, wooden shovels, and handcarts. The work was endless. A street cleared in the morning could be filthy again by evening. Sometimes the city decreed organized cleaning days when residents were required to sweep the space before their homes. Those who failed could be fined, though enforcement was lax. The real challenge was not laziness but infrastructure. There was simply nowhere to put the waste. Most of it ended up in open pits on the city's outskirts or dumped along the Seine's banks. When the wind blew from the wrong direction, even the wealthiest quarters could not escape the smell, and yet there was a strange sort of equilibrium. Paris functioned despite the filth. The people adapted. They used perfumes, carried pomanders, and kept windows shuttered against the worst of it. Life went on loud, colourful, and malodorous. Perfume and the art of survival. In no other city was perfume so essential. The 18th century was the golden age of French scent, not because people were clean, but precisely because they were not. Perfume masked the unmaskable. Aristocrats drenched themselves in floral waters and musks. Wigs were powdered not only for fashion but to disguise the odour of sweat and grace. Gloves were soaked in ambergris and violet essence. Even letters were perfumed, a small defence against the pervasive atmosphere of decay. But beneath the luxury lay desperation. For all their elegance, even the nobles lived amid the same air. The Palace of Versailles, though grand, had few toilets and fewer drains. Servants carried chamber pots through marble halls. The smell of perfume mixed with that of humanity in an uneasy alliance. It was an age when refinement and filth coexisted, each defining the other. The first public reforms. By the middle of the 18th century, pressure for reform was growing. Paris was now home to over 500,000 people, and the old medieval infrastructure could no longer cope. Intellectuals of the Enlightenment, men like Diderot, Buffon and Voltaire, began to write not only about philosophy and reason, but about hygiene, civic order, and the duty of government to protect public health. Cleanliness, they argued, was a form of civilization. In 1740, new regulations required cesspits to be constructed with sealed bottoms to prevent seepage into wells. The city also began experimenting with covered drains, a small but revolutionary step toward the modern sewer. The idea that waste should be contained rather than tolerated was taking root. Still, progress was slow. The night soil men continued their rounds. The gutters still ran down the middle of the street. The signs still shimmered with refuse. But something had shifted in the collective imagination, the belief that the city could change. That filth was not destiny. The smell of the future. By the time you walk through Paris in 1750, you can sense the tension between the old and the new. The city still reeks, but now there are voices calling for a different kind of urban life. One where air and water are not enemies. Pamphlets circulate proposing bold ideas: underground channels, street paving, public latrines, organized waste collection. Engineers sketch fantastical machines to pump and flush, to filter and purify. The age of sanitation is still a dream, but a dream that smells faintly of hope. For now, though, the streets remain what they have long been: noisy, crowded, and alive with the odors of a city that has yet to learn how to clean itself. And as evening falls, you can still hear the rattle of carts and the soft, sloshing rhythm of barrels being rolled through alleyways, the night soil men returning for another round. But what will happen when science, wealth, and revolution converge, when the theories of hygiene collide with the politics of progress? Can a city so ancient truly cleanse itself, or will it simply bury its filth deeper underground? The year is 1789. The streets of Paris are restless. The air smells of bread, sweat, and the smoke of torches. Revolution is coming, not only against kings and taxes, but against centuries of rot, decay, and neglect. Yet in this chapter of history, the enemy is not just monarchy, but filth itself. The old order collapses, and so do the sewers. Before the revolution, the city's filth was, paradoxically, a form of control. The poor were blamed for it, the rich ignored it, and the state tolerated it. Streets were the domain of smells, and smells belonged to class. The aristocracy had perfume, the poor had the gutter. But when the revolution broke out in 1789, that order dissolved. Streets became political spaces. Crowds gathered, barricades rose, and for the first time, the sewers beneath the city became tools of survival. Rebels and smugglers hid in their damp tunnels, using the underworld as both escape route and arsenal. There are accounts of revolutionaries dumping confiscated powder kegs into abandoned cesspits for storage. A mix of danger and irony, given the fumes already lingering there. The city above trembled with change, but below ground its arteries remained clogged. By 1794, municipal records show that waste collection had virtually collapsed. The vidangers were unpaid or dead. Street sweeping had ceased. The Seine ran darker than ever. Disease spread through overcrowded quarters. Paris was no longer just a city of ideas. It was, quite literally, a city stewing in its own revolution. Miasma and the science of smell. After the storm came reflection. In the early 19th century, as the new French Republic struggled to rebuild, thinkers and physicians began to study what had long been endured, the relationship between stench and sickness. This was the era of the miasma theory, the belief that diseases arose from bad air, malaria, literally bad air, emanating from decomposing matter. It was a flawed theory, but it had one redeeming effect. It inspired cleanliness. Doctors measured O's, mapped drains. Officials wrote endless reports on the atmospheric quality of neighborhoods. One physician, Jean Nogle-Halle, wrote in 1802 that city must breathe as a body breathes. He described Paris as a vast organism suffering from congestion. His words, half poetic and half scientific, would set the tone for the next century of urban reform. In this new vision, cleaning the city became not only a matter of comfort but of survival, an act of collective medicine. The fight against filth was the fight for life. Napoleon's city of order. When Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power, he saw in cleanliness a reflection of control. A city properly drained was a city properly governed. In 1802, he ordered an extensive inspection of Paris's underground network. A patchwork of medieval tunnels, abandoned aqueducts, and half-flooded cesspits. The findings were alarming. Much of it was unusable, some of it forgotten entirely. Napoleon, a man of systems and maps, responded by ordering a citywide reorganization. The first official engineer of sewers, Pierre-Emmanuel Brunceau, was appointed in 1805. His task to chart every inch of the subterranean labyrinth. Brunceau descended personally into the darkness. By lantern light, knee-deep in black sludge, he and his men mapped miles of tunnels. It took 7 years. They encountered collapsed vaults, ancient bones, and the remains of wooden pipes dating back to the Middle Ages. But they emerged with something revolutionary, a plan. For the first time, Paris had a complete survey of its underground. The hidden world had been brought to paper. Brunceau's maps became the blueprint for modern sanitation. Even Victor Hugo would later write of him as a hero who brought order to the empire of filth. Napoleon, pleased, declared that to govern Paris is to master both its streets and its sewers. And so began the city's slow metamorphosis. From chaos to order, from surface to depth, the smell of progress. With maps came construction. Throughout the early 1800s, new tunnels were dug beneath the city. Arched stone drains replaced open gutters. Cesspits were connected to underground channels that carried waste toward the Seine. Imperfect, but progress nonetheless. At the same time, the streets above began to change. For centuries, Paris's narrow medieval lanes had resisted reform. But now, under the hand of engineers and administrators, they were widened, paved, and graded for easier cleaning. Water fountains multiplied. New regulations required landlords to maintain their drains. And in 1818, a remarkable innovation appeared: the flusher. Using mechanical pumps, city workers could send torrents of river water down the sewers to clear blockages. The city began at last to cleanse itself, with water as both weapon and ally. Still, not everyone approved. Many Parisians resented the taxes that funded these improvements. Others distrusted the notion of hidden tunnels, fearing collapse or contamination. The work was noisy, disruptive, and slow, but the engineers persisted, driven by a new civic faith, that cleanliness was the foundation of civilization. Life on the surface, while the underground world transformed, life above it remained complex. The Parisian poor, crammed into cramped rooms and courtyards, still endured dampness, rot, and disease. The sewers might be deeper, but poverty remained near the surface. Water carriers still trudged through streets with wooden yokes. Washerwomen still scrubbed clothes along the Seine, often beside open drains. The stench of tannery still hung heavy over the Bièvre River. Progress was selective, and hygiene followed wealth. In the fashionable quarters, however, a new idea of urban beauty was emerging. The bourgeoisie embraced hygiene as a mark of virtue. Soap advertisements filled newspapers. Perfume became subtler, symbolizing refinement rather than disguise. A clean home was now a moral statement, a sign that one had risen above the filth of the old order. Public hygiene was becoming ideology. The cholera lesson in 1832. Paris was struck by a visitor far more terrifying than any Revolutionary Army cholera. It arrived quietly in March, carried by river traffic from the east. Within weeks, it spread through the crowded quarters near Les Halles and the Faubourg Saint-Marcel. The symptoms were brutal: vomiting, cramps, and a deathly blue pallor. The disease killed more than 18,000 Parisians in just a few months. The wealthy fled to the countryside. The poor died in their beds, And in the aftermath, one thing became clear: filth had made the city vulnerable. Doctors debated the cause. Some still blamed miasma, the bad air of unclean places. Others began to suspect something in the water itself. Either way, the crisis spurred action. The city doubled its efforts to expand the sewer system. Public fountains were built to supply cleaner water. Burial grounds were moved outside city walls. And civic pride began to merge with sanitary zeal. To live cleanly was not just healthy, it was patriotic. The cholera epidemic, though tragic, marked the birth of modern public health in Paris. Haussmann and the great transformation. Then came Baron Georges Hugues Haussmann, the man who would reshape Paris forever. Appointed by Napoleon III in 1853, Haussmann envisioned a city of light, order and flow. Wide boulevards replaced medieval alleys. Parks opened where tenements had stood, and beneath it all, the sewers, those vast vaulted tunnels, expanded into a modern network. Under the supervision of engineer Hugues Belgrand, the underground of Paris became a masterpiece of engineering. Brick-lined tunnels large enough to walk through stretched for miles. Fresh water was separated from waste for the first time. Pumping stations, reservoirs, and flushing systems transformed the city's relationship with its own refuse. It was a revolution of stone and water. Victor Hugo immortalized this new underworld in Les Miserables 1862, where Jane Valjean carries Marius through the dark sewers, a descent into filth that becomes a metaphor for redemption. To the public, the sewers symbolized both the shame and salvation of the city. By the 1850s, Paris had achieved something no medieval mind could have imagined. It had made sanitation beautiful. The boring glory of the sewer tours in 1867, the city went one step further. It opened the sewers to tourists. Visitors, wearing long coats and holding lanterns, could ride in small boats through the clean water channels, guided by uniformed attendants. It was a spectacle of civic pride, a celebration of pipes and tunnels, valves and vaults. Newspapers called it the underworld of progress. Foreign dignitaries marveled at the symmetry of it all, the underground mirror of the orderly city above. Even Queen Victoria's son, the Prince of Wales, was said to have toured it, remarking that smells of triumph, the very thing once feared, darkness, filth, decay, had become a symbol of modern civilization. Paris, the city of light, had learned to illuminate even its shadows. The quiet revolution completed by 1850, the Parisian sewer network extended nearly 350 kilometers. The sign, though still imperfect, was cleaner than in living memory. Public fountains provided safe water to thousands. Street sweepers, now uniformed and mechanized, kept the boulevards clear. The city, once infamous for its stench, had redefined cleanliness itself. Hygiene was now a civic religion, taught in schools and celebrated in architecture. The old city of cesspits and gutters still existed in memory, in the stories of the vidangers and washerwomen, in the forgotten courtyards and vanished alleys. But the smell, once synonymous with Paris, was fading. The great irony, of course, was that the very system designed to hide filth had made it invisible. The underground world thrived, unseen, a silent machine of order and decay. Paris had conquered its own stench, but also buried part of its soul. And yet, one question lingers beneath the stone vaults and flowing water. When a city cleans itself so completely, what traces of its past, its dirt, its sweat, its humanity, are lost in the process? By the mid-19th century, Paris had changed so completely that even Parisians barely recognized it. The old medieval heart, with its twisting alleys and open gutters, had been replaced by boulevards straight as rulers, flanked by tall, pale buildings with mansard roofs and iron balconies. Gas lamps lined the avenues, fountains glittered in the squares, and below it all, invisible but essential, lay a second city, the sewers. The filth had not disappeared, it had simply learned how to hide. The quiet work of water. By the 1860s, engineer Hugues Belgrand's vast underground system was in full operation. He approached water not as a nuisance but as a force to be guided, to cleanse, carry, and circulate. His network of tunnels and aqueducts formed a kind of hydraulic organism beneath the city, pulsing with constant movement. Fresh water was brought in from distant sources through aqueducts, the Duis, the Van, the Ava, stretching for miles into the countryside. Wastewater, meanwhile, was carried away through vast arched tunnels, flushed daily with torrents from the Seine. The design was as elegant as it was practical. Belgrand believed that even waste deserved dignity. He constructed his tunnels high and symmetrical, with vaulted ceilings and carefully laid stone blocks. Iron walkways and gas lamps allowed workers to move through them in relative safety. It was said that the sewers of Paris were so beautiful that one could walk through them without shame, though few ever did by choice. Above ground, The difference was profound. Streets stayed cleaner. Disease declined. The stench that had once defined Paris gradually became a memory. A visitor from London wrote in 1872 that Paris smells of bread and flowers, not of men. It was the highest compliment the city could have received. The men who worked below, yet, for all its grandeur, the underworld remained the domain of a few, the égoutiers, or sewer workers. Their lives were hidden from polite society, but their work sustained it. By day, they maintained the flow of the city's unseen river. By night, they patrolled the tunnels with lamps, clearing debris and inspecting vaults. They walked miles each week, waist deep in cool, grey water, guided by the echo of their boots and the rhythmic gurgle of the current. The égoutiers took quiet pride in their work. To them, the sewers were not repulsive but mechanical, a place of structure and discipline. They learned to read the sound of the flow, to sense blockages by ear, to detect leaks by smell. Some even claimed to recognize neighborhoods by their scent. The Latin Quarter smells of old books. One worker told a journalist in 1887. Montmartre smells of wine. The Marais smells of dust and the dead. It was an art form of its own, a sensory map of the living city above. The workers were few in number, a few hundred at most, but they enjoyed rare privileges. Their wages were stable, their jobs secure, and their labor considered vital. They were, in a sense, the priests of an invisible faith, the guardians of cleanliness, protecting a society that preferred not to think about what they did. The city of air and light, meanwhile, life above ground, entered a golden age. Paris became a model for modern urban planning, its boulevards copied from Vienna to Buenos Aires. Visitors marveled at its fountains, its public baths, and its glittering cleanliness. The Exposition Universelle of 1889, which unveiled the Eiffel Tower, celebrated not only art and industry but sanitation itself. One exhibit proudly displayed sections of the city's waterworks, showing how every street connected to a network of pipes and drains. For the first time in history, cleanliness had become spectacle. Hygiene entered the realm of aesthetics. Buildings were designed with smooth facades and easy-to-clean surfaces. Public bathhouses and laundries became social institutions. Even literature reflected the new obsession with purity. Writers like Émile Zola and Gustave Flaubert described cleanliness as moral order, filth as moral decay. The transformation was cultural as much as physical. To be modern was to be clean was to be civilized. And yet, some mourned what had been lost. The organic chaos, the mingling of smells and lives that had once defined the old city. A few writers, like Charles Baudelaire, spoke of nostalgia for the soiled soul of Paris, where the sacred and the sordid had once coexisted. The city had learned how to breathe, but perhaps, in the process, had forgotten how to dream. The science of sanitation behind the poetry and politics, a quieter revolution was taking place in laboratories and universities. The 19th century saw the birth of bacteriology, the discovery that disease was caused not by miasma but by microorganisms. Louis Pasteur, working in Paris in the 1860s, demonstrated that invisible germs, not bad smells, spread illness. His experiments on fermentation, vaccination, and sterilization transformed medicine, and indirectly, the very logic of cities. With Pasteur's discoveries, hygiene became scientific. The war on smell evolved into a war on microbes. Cleanliness was no longer about pleasant air but about invisible safety. Water had to be filtered, pipes disinfected, and waste treated before being released. The invisible enemy had changed shape, but the battle continued. Paris adapted. Sand filtration systems were installed in waterworks. Public health inspectors monitored food and wells. Sewage, once dumped directly into the Seine, was redirected to irrigation fields outside the city, where it was used to fertilize crops. A neat return to the old cycle, but now with science to justify it. By the 1890s, the city's sanitation network was one of the most advanced in the world. It was no longer an afterthought, but a point of civic pride, the literal foundation of the modern metropolis. Cleanliness and control, yet beneath the triumph of hygiene lurked a quieter truth. Cleanliness was also power. The new ordered city was easier to police. Wide boulevards prevented barricades. Regularized housing separated classes. The invisible infrastructure of pipes and drains mirrored an invisible infrastructure of governance, a system that dictated how people lived, moved, and even smelled. Haussmann's city was not only sanitary but disciplined. The same rational geometry that carried away waste also carried away disorder. Sociologists and historians later observed that the sewer, that hidden, controlled flow, symbolized the new urban order: efficient, silent, centralized. The people who once lived in chaos were now contained, much like the waste that sustained them. Cleanliness, in the end, was not just about health. It was about obedience. Echoes of the old city. Even as Paris celebrated its modernity, the old city refused to vanish entirely. In the poorer suburbs, the banlieues beyond the new walls, conditions remained grim. Cesspits still overflowed. Water was scarce. The smell of tanneries lingered on the Bièvre River well into the 20th century. The grand boulevards hid narrow alleys just behind them, where families lived as they always had, with buckets, basins, and damp walls. Visitors to the Paris Sewer Museum, opened in 1889, were both fascinated and uneasy. Some admired the order and engineering. Others left pale, murmuring that civilization was a thin crust over something primal. In the tunnels below, rats thrived. Floods sometimes forced open manholes, reminding Parisians that their buried filth was never truly gone, merely waiting. It was said that the smell of the old Paris could still be found on rainy days, when the sewers exhaled through the drains, releasing a faint, earthy ghost of centuries past. The philosophy of filth. By the dawn of the 20th century, Paris had achieved what earlier generations would have called impossible. It had mastered its own waste. But with mastery came reflection. Philosophers and poets began to ask uncomfortable questions. Was filth simply the opposite of cleanliness? Or was it part of what made life human? Could a city be too clean, too mechanical, too sterile to truly live? Sociologist Georges Bataille later wrote that waste is the shadow of civilization. Every act of creation produces its residue. Every system hides its byproduct. The sewers, in that sense, were the unconscious of Paris, the dark mirror of its rational mind. And perhaps, he suggested, a city without shadows was a city without soul. Modern echoes today, the Paris sewer network stretches over 500 kilometers. It still carries waste and water beneath the same streets where revolution once raged. The égotiers still patrol it, wearing rubber suits and headlamps, tending to valves and pumps much as their 19th century predecessors did. Tourists still descend into the sewer museum, now cleaned and lighted, where guides explain the history of sanitation in calm, measured tones. Few realize that the cool, faintly damp air they breathe carries traces of centuries of human life. The city above still glows at night, polished, perfumed, and bright. But every drop that leaves a sink or flushes from a toilet still joins the same subterranean river, flowing through the vaulted arteries designed by Belgrand and Brunceau, carrying away what civilization prefers not to see. The great miracle of Paris is not that it is clean, but that it learned how to live with its filth, not to eliminate it, but to organize it. The stillness beneath, if you stand on a bridge at midnight, say the Pont Neuf, where the sign moves silently beneath the lights, and listen carefully, you might almost hear the other river, the one below, slower, darker, older. It has been flowing for hundreds of years, carrying the memory of every century that lived and died above it. It is the sound of a city breathing, exiling history through its hidden lungs. And if you listen long enough, it begins to sound less like water and more like time itself, endlessly washing away what came before. For all its grandeur, the story of Paris is, in the end, the story of cleaning up after ourselves, of the strange, endless human effort to turn chaos into order, and the quiet beauty that hides in the boring, necessary work beneath our feet. So perhaps the question isn't how Paris cleaned itself, but why we are always trying to do the same, to bury what offends us, to sanitize what reminds us of our nature, to forget that all cities, all civilizations, are built upon the things we would rather not see. And maybe, just maybe, the sewer is not the shame of the city, but its truest reflection. Imagine a plain so vast that the horizon dissolves in haze. A single man stands there squinting into the distance, beside a massive metal instrument balanced on a tripod. Around him, Indian laborers hold rods, flags, and ropes. The sun is relentless. The air quivers with heat. He raises a telescope to his eye, not to see what is near, but to measure the invisible. The year is 1802, and this man, Colonel William Lambton, is about to begin one of the longest and most exhausting scientific projects in human history, the Great Trigonometrical Survey of India. It will take nearly 70 years to complete. It will span the entire subcontinent, from Cape Comorin at the southern tip to the snowline of the Himalayas. It will claim lives, fortunes, and reputations, and it will change not only maps but empires. The empire of measurement. At the turn of the 19th century, the British East India Company had already conquered vast portions of India, but its empire was strangely incomplete. It ruled without truly knowing the land it possessed. Maps were imprecise, boundaries uncertain, distances guessed. The very ground beneath its administrators was, in a bureaucratic sense, unmeasured. The East India Company wanted to tax, build, and control, but one cannot rule what one cannot measure. And so, they decided to map India in the most literal sense possible, by triangulation, using mathematics and instruments to establish exact distances between fixed points on the Earth's surface, forming a network of triangles that could stretch across a continent. Each triangle would anchor another, creating a geometric web, an invisible grid of empire. But such a project required extraordinary precision, and precision, in the age before engines or electricity, demanded human endurance. The weight of accuracy, Colonel Lambton, an English officer with a taste for mathematics and heat, proposed the survey in 1800. His goal was audacious, to measure an arc of longitude running north-south through India with such accuracy that it could be used to determine the exact shape of the Earth itself. At the time, the planet's true form, slightly flattened at the poles, was still a matter of scientific debate. The Great Arc, as it would be called, would settle that question for the Eastern Hemisphere. Lambton's instruments were monumental. His base, line-measuring chain weighed nearly half a ton. His zenith sector, used to measure the angle of stars, required a team of oxen to move. His theodolite, built by William Carey of London, was so large that it needed 12 men to lift it. When it was shipped to India, it barely survived the journey. The ship caught fire, and the instrument was salvaged from the flames, scorched but intact. Instruments aside, Lambton's greatest challenge was not the machinery, but the land itself. A continent of obstacles, southern India was a labyrinth of obstacles. To measure a single triangle, Lambton had to see, literally, from one point to another, often over 10 or 20 miles of terrain. That meant building signal towers on hilltops, often several stories high, to raise a flag or lantern visible across the plain. In the process, surveyors crossed jungles alive with tigers and malaria, climbed volcanic ridges, and waded through swamps that swallowed their instruments. The brass of the theodolite grew too hot to touch under the sun. The steel measuring chains expanded and contracted with temperature, throwing off calculations. To correct for this, Lambton invented a system of temperature compensation, measuring the chain's expansion by thermometer and adjusting accordingly. Every fraction mattered. An error of 1 inch over a few miles could distort a map for hundreds of miles beyond. In an age without computers, every number was recorded by hand, double-checked by candlelight, and recalculated by human patience. A single triangle could take months. The men of the Great Arc, the survey, employed thousands: engineers, draftsmen, soldiers, and, most importantly, Indian laborers and assistants whose names rarely appeared in official reports, but without whom the work would have been impossible. They carried instruments on bamboo poles, cleared vegetation, built signal platforms, and sighted mirrors over long distances. In the evenings they cooked, repaired tools, and camped in the dust. Their wages were small, their exposure great. Fever, snakebite, and exhaustion were constant companions. Lambton himself, eccentric and stoic, lived like his men, sleeping in tents, rising before dawn, and often working through nights to take astronomical readings. He was known for his temper, his devotion to accuracy, and his disregard for comfort. Once, when a subordinate complained of heat stroke, Lambton replied mildly that the stars do not wait for weather. Science, empire, and the sky, the Great Arc, was both scientific and imperial. On one hand, it sought to advance human knowledge, to understand the Earth's curvature and the laws of measurement. On the other, it served the ambitions of empire to delineate borders, assess taxes, and tighten control. The data collected by Lambton's teams would be used to redraw provincial boundaries, plan railways, and fix property lines. In many cases, villagers discovered they were in one district rather than another, their fates altered by the invisible hand of geometry. This merging of science and power was characteristic of the age. The British prided themselves on rationality, on measurement as a form of mastery. To survey the land was to own it twice, once by conquest, and again by calculation. Yet even as the empire measured India, the land resisted, through weather, disease, and sheer immensity. The jungle and the star, each measurement of the Great Arc, required two forms of observation, one terrestrial, one celestial. The terrestrial determined distances between points, the celestial fixed their positions relative to the stars. At night, Lambton's men aimed telescopes at the zenith, the highest point in the sky, and recorded the angle of a chosen star as it crossed the meridian. These observations, repeated over months, allowed them to determine latitude with astonishing precision. The combination of earth and sky gave the survey its quiet poetry, a geometry of empire anchored in heaven. But it was grueling work. Observations demanded absolute stillness. The slightest vibration, even a passing bullock cart, could ruin hours of data. Sometimes a reading would be lost to a passing cloud, and the team would wait days for another chance. In one surviving account, an assistant wrote, "The Colonel, though ill and shaking, would not rest. He sat beneath the lantern, the sweat upon his face like dew, his eyes fixed upon the star until it was gone." Such was the devotion the great ark required, a kind of monastic endurance, where precision replaced prayer. Tragedy and legacy. In 1823, after more than 2 decades of work, Lambton died suddenly of cholera near Hinginghat, his notes unfinished beside him. He was 70 years old and had measured less than half of the ark. The project might have ended there, a heroic failure, had it not been taken up by his assistant and successor, George Everest, a man as brilliant as he was difficult. Everest would continue Lambton's work, refine his methods, and eventually complete the ark that stretched from the southern tip of India to the foothills of Nepal. His name, bestowed by later admirers, would eventually be given to the world's highest mountain, a tribute to a surveyor who, ironically, never saw it. But in the years after Lambton's death, the great ark remained fragile, its progress uncertain, its future unsure. The world was changing. Steam, telegraphs, and new sciences were transforming how humans measured their surroundings. Yet in India, under the burning sun, the work continued, slow, meticulous, and invisible. The unseen empire. By 1830, thousands of miles of triangulation lines had been established, stretching like invisible veins across India's surface. They connected mountain peaks, temples, and observatories, a network of geometry binding together millions of lives. To the Indian peasants who watched from their fields, the surveyors were a strange tribe, men who built towers only to stare at stars, who recorded endless numbers without explanation, and who sometimes demanded the clearing of sacred trees or the moving of shrines that lay in the line of sight. It was a quiet, bureaucratic form of conquest, one that moved not by gunfire, but by angle and distance. And in the end, perhaps the strangest thing of all is that the great ark, though rarely remembered, changed the shape of the world. It allowed for the mapping of Asia, the fixing of longitudes, the calibration of time itself. It gave empire its geometry, and modern science its foundation. But the story of the great ark was far from over, for when George Everest inherited Lambton's project, he would face not only the same jungles and fever, but also a deeper question: could precision truly capture a land as vast, complex, and alive as India? When Colonel William Lambton died in 1823, the great trigonometrical survey was only half finished. An immense and fragile project sprawled across the southern half of India. His successor, George Everest, inherited not a well-oiled operation but a mess of equipment, papers, and exhausted men. It was as if a single thread of a vast tapestry had been spun and now hung, frayed, in the monsoon wind. Everest's task was not just to continue the work, but to refine, defend, and modernize it in an empire that was itself changing rapidly. The reluctant successor, George Everest, was a complex man. Born in Wales in 1790, he joined the East India Company's army as a young officer, eventually finding himself assigned to Lambton's survey team. He was brilliant, meticulous, and quick-tempered, a perfectionist with little tolerance for error. Where Lambton had been patient and quietly obsessive, Everest was fiery and argumentative, known for his biting letters and his fierce insistence on precision. He did not seek fame, he sought accuracy. Every calculation, every angle, every observation had to meet his uncompromising standard. When he took over in 1823, Everest found the great ark in disarray. Instruments were damaged, funds uncertain, and the survey's very purpose questioned by officials in Calcutta who saw little use in such expensive mathematics. Everest spent years rebuilding its credibility, defending its scientific rigor to bureaucrats who barely understood its goals. He was, in many ways, a surveyor fighting a war not only against nature, but against paperwork. The chain across India under Everest's direction, the survey entered its most ambitious phase, the extension of the great ark northward, across the central plains and into the rough, forested terrain of northern India. The distances were staggering. Each triangle in the network stretched over dozens of miles, measured and verified by astronomical observation. The baselines, the foundational straight measurements from which all other distances were calculated, were the key to everything. To measure one, Everest's teams laid out steel chains over flat plains, correcting for slope, temperature, and sag. Each baseline was measured twice in opposite directions, using dozens of thermometers and hundreds of wooden stakes. Every few hundred yards, the chains were lifted, cleaned, and realigned, a process that took months. When completed, a single baseline might be just 7 miles long, but its accuracy would determine the precision of the entire subcontinent's map. Everest's most famous base line, at Dehradun, required nearly 1,000 labourers and more than a year to complete. The temperature varied so wildly between morning and afternoon that the metal expanded and contracted visibly. The surveyors worked in shifts, sleeping in tents, surrounded by forest and humidity so dense that even ink refused to dry. Instruments of obsession, the tools of the great ark had grown in both sophistication and size. Everest's chief instrument was the great theodolite, a behemoth of brass and glass weighing over 1,000 pounds. It was a monument to precision and to frustration. Transporting it was a logistical nightmare. When the survey moved, elephants carried it in its own custom-built howdah cushioned by straw and leather straps. If an elephant stumbled, the instrument could be ruined. On one occasion, a theodolite fell into a river, and Everest, according to one account, wept like a man who had lost a child. And each instrument had to be recalibrated constantly. Screws loosened in the heat, bubbles in the spirit levels shifted. Compass needles wavered under magnetic disturbances. Everest's team often spent entire days adjusting the alignment of a single instrument before a single observation could be taken. The work was slow to the point of absurdity, but it was also revolutionary. By 1830, the survey's precision was unmatched anywhere in the world. Measurements made under Everest's supervision would later be found to differ by less than a few inches when rechecked with modern equipment. A feat nearly miraculous for its time. The human coast, if the instruments were unforgiving, the environment was worse. Surveying meant living outdoors for years, often in uninhabited or hostile regions. Everest's teams faced monsoons, malaria, tigers, and endless fatigue. Fever swept through the camps regularly, leaving half the crew incapacitated. Food was basic rice, salted meat, and tea. Water was boiled when possible, though often drawn straight from muddy rivers. In some seasons, entire sections of the team were lost to disease, only to be replaced by new recruits from nearby villages. The Indian assistants, skilled mathematicians, draftsmen, and instrument operators, were indispensable. Many of them came from local communities of surveyors and artisans, their knowledge passed down through generations. They were fluent in trigonometry, in the use of sextants and compasses, and in the mathematics of the stars. Yet in the official reports, their names were rarely recorded. They appeared only as native subordinates, or assistants. Without them, the Great Ark would have collapsed. But in the Empire's story, they remained invisible. One of them, Radhanath Sikdar, would later calculate the height of the world's tallest mountain, the one eventually named after Everest himself. The Empire's grid by the 1830s, the Great Ark had become the backbone of the survey of India, the central reference from which all regional mapping radiated. Villages were plotted, rivers traced, roads measured. With each new triangle, the British state extended its reach into the countryside. Land that had been locally known, described in oral traditions, local maps, and temple records, was now codified into the Empire's geometry. This was more than cartography, it was administration by measurement. Taxes were assessed with new precision, boundaries redrawn, and disputes resolved according to maps rather than memory. The land itself began to change under the weight of its new coordinates. A farmer's field could be transferred to another district. A village once governed by one prince might now belong to another. The act of measurement became a quiet but profound reshaping of India's social and political landscape. And yet, to the surveyors, it was simply data, numbers in a ledger, lines on a sheet. The man and his mountain, despite his achievements, George Everest was a difficult man to work under. His insistence on accuracy often came across as arrogance. He demanded total obedience from his subordinates and wrote scathing letters to anyone who questioned his methods. He had little patience for bureaucracy, but plenty of contempt for those who misunderstood science. One official complained that Everest's correspondence was a mixture of algebra and insult. In 1843, after 2 decades of relentless labor, Everest finally retired, exhausted and nearly blind from years of sun glare and instrument work. His successors would continue the arc northward into the Himalayas, using his triangulations as their foundation. 2 decades later, when surveyors began measuring the great peaks of the Himalayas, they identified one that stood higher than any other. The team debated what to call it. The local names, Chomolungma, Sagarmatha, were known but not well recorded in their reports. In the end, the mountain was named Everest, in honor of the man who had standardized the very measurements that made its height calculable. George Everest himself disliked the idea. He objected that his name could not be easily pronounced in India, and that he had never even seen the mountain. But the name remained, a permanent, accidental tribute to a man who had tried only to measure the earth, not to conquer it. The silent revolution by the late 1840s. The Great Arc had transformed from an experiment into an institution. Its methods, chains, theodolites, triangulations, were taught in academies and replicated across the empire. The Survey of India became one of the most powerful bureaucracies in Asia, employing thousands of Indians and Britons in a ceaseless act of measurement. The empire itself now rested upon this mathematical skeleton. Every road, railway, and administrative district built atop Lambton and Everest's invisible grid. And yet, for all its precision, the survey revealed something unsettling. The Earth, it seemed, was not the smooth, symmetrical sphere that early scientists had imagined. Everest data suggested subtle variations, a lopsidedness, a bulge, as if the planet itself resisted perfect measurement. It was a humbling discovery even at its most exact. Human understanding was still approximate. The question of ownership, the more the empire measured India, the more it came to believe it understood India. But knowledge and possession are not the same. The surveyors could map every hill and river, yet they could not chart the lives of those who lived among them. The farmers, artisans, monks, and traders who experienced the land not as triangles and latitudes, but as home. When the first detailed maps of India were finally printed and distributed to British officials, they were hailed as triumphs of order. But to many Indians, these maps were alien documents, strange diagrams that ignored the spiritual, cultural, and emotional geography that had defined the subcontinent for millennia. It was a quiet irony: the more precisely the empire measured, the more it misunderstood what it measured. As George Everest left India in 1847, the Great Arc stood only a few degrees short of the Himalayas. Ahead lay some of the most treacherous terrain in the world: jungles, mountains, and regions politically off limits to the British. His successors would face challenges that combined science, politics, and survival in equal measure. The final stretch of the Great Arc would demand new kinds of courage, new instruments, and new minds, both British and Indian. The question now was not whether the Earth could be measured, but whether an empire could survive the truths it revealed. Picture once again the Indian horizon. It is 1850. The air trembles with heat. A small group of men stand on a ridge near the northern plains, their eyes fixed on a distant glimmer. The faint mirror signal from another mountain peak, 20 miles away. Between them lies forest, river, and haze. Above them, the monsoon clouds are gathering, slow and dark. This was the frontier of science and empire, the final phase of a project that had begun half a century earlier. Under the blazing southern sun, the Great Trigonometrical Survey of India had reached its last, most formidable challenge: the Himalayas. A new generation of surveyors after George Everest's retirement in 1847. The survey passed to a new leader, Andrew Scott Wharf, a disciplined and pragmatic engineer who had served under Everest for years. Where Everest had been volatile, Wharf was measured. Where Everest demanded perfection, Wharf sought progress. His task was to finish what Lambton and Everest had begun, to extend the Great Arc all the way to the northern mountains and tie it, mathematically, to the curvature of the Earth itself. By then, the survey was more than a scientific venture. It was an institution, employing hundreds of Europeans and thousands of Indian workers. Its methods were codified, its precision legendary. The Great Arc, stretching from Cape Comorin to the Himalayan foothills, had already become a symbol of imperial mastery, proof that Britain could not only conquer territory but understand it. And yet, the northern frontier was unlike anything the surveyors had faced. Here, the land rose in violent folds, jungles thickened into mountain forests, and the air thinned with altitude. Visibility was often poor, and the distances between peaks impossible to measure directly. The Great Arc, which had advanced through plains and plateaus by triangles of vision, now faced a wall of cloud and stone. The ghost in the mountains, from his base in Dehradun, Wharf began planning an ambitious extension of the arc northward. The key was to locate and measure a series of peaks visible from multiple stations. To use them as reference points, like celestial anchors, teams were sent into the foothills of Nepal and Sikkim, taking sightings with theodolites the size of small carriages. It was during this phase, in the early 1850s, that the surveyors made a curious discovery. Among the countless peaks they measured, one towered above the rest. It had no known local name in their data records, though the surrounding summits were catalogued. Its coordinates were logged as Peak XV. In 1852, after years of calculation, an Indian mathematician in the Calcutta office, Radhanath Sikdar, noticed something extraordinary. Based on the raw data from multiple observations, he computed that Peak XV stood higher than any mountain previously recorded. He rushed into Worf's office and exclaimed, "Sir, I believe I have found the highest mountain in the world." Worf verified the data over the next 2 years, ensuring it met the survey's legendary standards of accuracy. In 1856, he officially announced the result. Peak XV's height was calculated at 2902 feet, remarkably close to modern measurements, which put it at 2931.7 feet. And in honor of his predecessor, Worf proposed naming it Mount Everest. The weight of a name, the naming was controversial even within the survey's own ranks. Many officers argued that the mountain already had indigenous names. Chomolungma in Tibet, Sagarmatha in Nepal, names known for centuries. But Worf insisted that none were consistently used in the survey's reference documents, and that assigning a uniform name would aid in international mapping. The decision reflected the quiet arrogance of empire that a mountain, timeless and sacred, could be renamed by decree. And yet, it was also a tribute to the stubborn Welshman whose calculations had made such measurements possible. Ironically, George Everest himself disliked the honor. He wrote from retirement that his name was not easily pronounced by the native peoples of India, and that he could not approve of such egotism. But the name stuck. Mount Everest, a mountain the man had never seen, named by those who measured but did not climb, became the symbol of the survey's triumph and the empire's ambition. Measuring the impossible beyond symbolic discoveries, the northern extension of the Great Arc demanded feats of endurance that reveled exploration itself. Survey parties traversed malaria-infested jungles, forded rivers swollen by monsoon rains, and ascended peaks higher than any yet measured by European science. At altitudes above 10,000 feet, air pressure affected the accuracy of instruments. Glass lenses fogged. Metal contracted unpredictably in the cold. Even ink thickened and refused to flow. Observers worked wrapped in blankets, their eyes watering in the wind, their fingers numb on the brass controls of theodolites. At night they took astronomical readings, aligning telescopes to distant stars, often through thin breaks in the clouds. Each observation required multiple verifications, often repeated across weeks to eliminate error. Their reward was data, columns upon columns of figures, angles, and temperature corrections. The labor of hundreds distilled into silent numbers. When those numbers reached Calcutta, they were checked again, recalculated by teams of Indian mathematicians and draftsmen. It could take years before a single line was finalized on a map. The quiet revolution beneath empire. By the 1860s, the Great Arc was complete. It stretched to 400 kilometers s1, 500 miles from the southern tip of India to the Himalayan foothills, forming the longest and most precise geodetic arc in human history. Its network of triangles covered nearly the entire subcontinent, linking mountains, rivers, temples, and coastlines into one continuous grid. The precision was staggering, less than 10 inches of error across the entire length. It confirmed not only India's shape but the curvature of the Earth itself, proving that the planet was slightly irregular, its mass unevenly distributed. These findings fed directly into the science of geodesy, refining global measurements of latitude, longitude, and gravity. The Great Arc became the foundation for modern mapping, navigation, and even satellite geodesy centuries later. Yet, at the time, its deeper implications went unnoticed by most. The empire saw it primarily as a tool of governance, a way to fix borders, collect taxes, and administer a vast and complex colony. Still, beneath that bureaucratic purpose lay something quieter and more enduring: the triumph of human patience. The invisible builders, thousands of unnamed Indian workers, engineers, and mathematicians had built the Great Arc. They were the ones who carried the instruments through jungles, built platforms on peaks, and calculated the endless numbers that turned landscapes into geometry. Their contribution was immense, yet in official reports they were mostly invisible. Some, like Radhanath Sikdar, left faint traces in correspondence and marginal notes. Others vanished entirely into the anonymity of native staff. It was only decades later that historians began to recognize how indispensable they had been, not merely as laborers, but as intellectuals, mathematicians, and engineers who kept the machinery of the survey running while the British officers came and went. The Great Arc, in truth, was a collaboration, though the credit was unevenly distributed, like the empire it served. Maps and control. The completion of the Great Arc coincided with a pivotal moment in India's history. The rebellion of 1857, a massive uprising against British rule, had revealed just how fragile the empire's grasp could be. In its aftermath, the East India Company was dissolved, and the British Crown took direct control of India. The new colonial administration relied heavily on the survey's maps to reorganize its rule. District boundaries were redrawn with military precision. New provinces were carved out, their limits defined by the coordinates established through decades of triangulation. Railway routes followed the lines of the survey's earlier base measurements, linking port cities to interior markets. In an unexpected way, the Great Arc became the skeleton upon which British India was built, not through conquest, but through measurement. Every tax office, police district, and military outpost referenced its coordinates. Every engineer and administrator depended on its accuracy. The empire, in the end, was not only enforced by soldiers, it was administered by surveyors. The legacy of precision when Andrew Wharf retired in 1861. The Great Trigonometrical Survey had already transformed into a scientific legend. Its methods were studied in Europe, its data cited by astronomers and physicists. It had refined global understanding of Earth's shape and confirmed, with exquisite accuracy, that the planet bulged slightly more in the south, a discovery that helped adjust the world's navigational systems for generations. In 1870, the final calculations were completed, the last triangles closed. The Great Arc was done. It had taken nearly 70 years, spanned 4 generations of surveyors, and measured an empire of more than 1 billion acres. Yet its most lasting impact was not on empire but on science itself, the idea that patient, precise observation could reveal truths beyond human sight. Reflections in dust today, little remains of the Great Arc's physical traces. The signal towers have crumbled, the theodolites sit in museums, and the camps have vanished beneath cities and farmland, but the invisible grid it created still underlies every modern map of India, and by extension much of the modern world's cartography. When you look at a GPS screen or a satellite map, you are, unknowingly, tracing the inheritance of Lambton Everest, Wharf, and thousands of Indian surveyors who turned the chaos of landscape into coordinates. It is easy to forget how laborious those coordinates once were. Each degree, each line of latitude was earned by sweat and suffering, by men staring at distant mirrors through shimmering air, by nights spent counting stars under oil lamps, by numbers calculated again and again until they agreed. And in that patience lies the true legacy of the Great Arc, not empire, not glory, but the quiet conviction that even the most immense world can be understood, inch by inch, through perseverance. The final thought: by the time the last measurements were completed, the world had entered a new age, of telegraphs, steamships, and industrial power. The Great Arc seemed, to some, a relic of a slower era, yet it remains one of humanity's purest expressions of curiosity, an act of endurance performed on a planetary scale. For all its imperial motives, it revealed something profoundly human, the desire to know where we stand. And perhaps that is the paradox of the Great Arc, that in measuring the Earth so precisely, the Empire also measured itself and found its own limits. Close your eyes and imagine the slow dawn of a Persian morning in the 12th century. The city of Nishapur, nestled along the Silk Road, wakes with the sound of traders setting up their stalls. The scent of cardamom and dust fills the air. Camels grunt in the distance, and from the minarets, the muezzin's call spreads like a ripple across tiled rooftops. Somewhere within the city's heart, behind walls covered in glazed blue tiles, sits a scholar wrapped in a woolen cloak, dipping his reed pen into ink as he begins another line. His name is Farid-ud-Din Attar, his profession perfumer, physician, and poet, his tools glass jars of musk and ambergris by day, and the Quran philosophical treatises, and piles of parchment by night. Attar of Nishapur, as he would later be known, was a man of contradictions, a tradesman with the soul of a mystic, and a mystic who never renounced the world. He lived in a time when Persia, then part of the vast Seljuk Empire, was both cultured and fragile, rich in poetry but shadowed by political decay. It was an era of extraordinary scholars: Omar Khayyam, the poet astronomer who measured the heavens, Al-Ghazali, the theologian who redefined the boundaries of faith, and soon Rumi, who would inherit Attar's flame. But unlike them, Attar's legacy would not lie in treatises or philosophy. His masterpiece was a story, a long, winding allegory told through the voices of birds. The age of poets and mystics. To understand Attar's work, one must first understand the peculiar world of 12th century Persia. The Seljuk Empire, though vast, was fracturing into smaller kingdoms. Local rulers fought for dominance while scholars and mystics turned inward, searching for meaning beyond politics. In the cities, Sufi orders were spreading, quiet brotherhoods of spiritual seekers who sought union with the divine through devotion, humility, and love. Their gatherings, filled with recitations and music, contrasted sharply with the rigid legalism of orthodox theologians. To many, Sufism offered solace, an escape from the uncertainties of war and politics. Attar, though not formally affiliated with any order, shared their yearning. By profession, he compounded medicines and perfumes, but by temperament, he was drawn to the invisible, the soul's illnesses, the scent of eternity. In one of his early poems he wrote, "I mixed musk and rose for the noses of kings, but what fragrance compares to the soul's remembering?" It was said that while working in his shop, he listened to travelers' stories, of deserts crossed, of saints met, of miracles seen. He recorded these tales, weaving them into moral parables. Over time, his small notebooks grew into volumes. From this collection emerged his most famous work, Mantiq al-Tayr, The Conference of the Birds. The poem's premise, the story begins, as all good Persian tales do, in a dreamlike world. A world where animals speak, where metaphors walk beside men, and where truth hides behind layers of allegory. All the birds of the world, from the proud peacock to the humble sparrow, gather together. They are restless, confused, and uncertain. Each feels that the world lacks order, that they need a ruler to guide them. The wise hoopoe, a small bird with a crown like crest, steps forward and proposes a journey. He tells the birds that their true king exists, but he lives far away, beyond 7 great valleys in the court of the Simur, a mythical bird of divine perfection. Each valley represents a stage of spiritual awakening, the Valley of Quest, where one abandons comfort and begins the search. The Valley of Love, where reason burns away in devotion. The Valley of Knowledge, where truth begins to appear. The Valley of Detachment, where the self is stripped of worldly ties. The Valley of Unity, where all distinctions dissolve. The Valley of Wonder, where the soul is lost in divine awe. The Valley of Poverty and Annihilation, where the seeker becomes nothing, and thus everything. The birds, each with their own excuses, hesitate. The nightingale is intoxicated by the rose and refuses to leave. The parrot dreams of eternal life and fears the journey's hardships. The peacock, once of paradise, cannot bear to recall his exile. The hoopoe listens patiently to them all, offering parables in reply, short, moral stories within the larger tale. This structure mirrors the very nature of Sufi teaching guidance delivered through stories, so that the mind might wander until it stumbles upon truth. Attar's mirror for the soul. Attar's poem is not just a religious allegory, it is also a mirror for human weakness. Each bird represents a human flaw: vanity, greed, fear, longing, pride. The journey toward the Simurgh is thus not about travel across land, but transformation within the self. The poem, written in rhyming couplets of Persian Masnavi, is vast, over 4,000 lines. Its tone shifts from humor to grief, from moral discipline to ecstatic surrender. Attar's genius lies in his ability to make the mystical seem almost ordinary, even domestic. When the hoopoe speaks of the Valley of Love, Attar writes, "In love, no life remains, nor death, nor will. The lover's heart is ash, the lover's hands are still." Yet, amid such abstract language, the imagery remains vivid and worldly. He writes of merchants, kings, beggars, and fools, the tapestry of everyday life. This is what makes the poem so hypnotic. It oscillates between heaven and earth, much like the life Attar himself lived. The historical context. A nation between worlds, Persia in Attar's time was a crossroads of culture. The Mongols had not yet arrived, but the region was already feeling the tremors of nomadic invasions from Central Asia. Trade routes connected Nishapur to Samarkand, Baghdad and Damascus. Scholars debated Aristotle in Arabic, while poets revived ancient Persian legends. Attar's language fused these influences, the clarity of Arabic scholarship with the dreamlike imagery of Persian storytelling. His world was one where a perfumer might quote Plato, and a dervish might argue theology in the marketplace. This mingling of the practical and the poetic gave rise to one of history's most distinctive literary traditions. A tradition that blurred the line between wisdom and wonder. The Parliament of Birds thus reflected not only the spiritual journey of individuals, but also a civilization's attempt to find meaning amid fragmentation. In a sense, the poem was Attar's response to empire, not through rebellion or rhetoric, but through metaphor. He built an empire of meaning instead of territory. The mechanics of boring, genius, to appreciate the work's full strangeness. Consider how deliberately uneventful much of it is. Attar does not rush. He allows the reader to linger in parable after parable, some lasting pages, others just a few lines. A merchant loses his fortune and learns humility. A king kills his son to prove faith. A lover weeps for years only to realize the beloved never existed. These stories accumulate like sediment, forming layers of quiet reflection. For the casual reader, it may seem repetitive, even boring. But for the Sufi reader, repetition is the point. To repeat a parable is to meditate on it, to let its meaning erode the walls of certainty like water wearing down stone. Attar was not writing to entertain,